Excellent. So then, welcome everyone to our little webinar this evening, Serviced Accommodation and Planning. Serviced accommodation has been in the planning news, it's been in the licensing news, it's been in the national news, it's even appeared in Hansard in the, which is the Westminster Minutes. It is a hot topic at the moment, and let's face it, it is worthwhile exploring inside of a webinar. So a little bit of an introduction for those of you who don't know me. My name's John McDermott. I'm a chartered town planner. I've got 21 years of experience, and I have indeed got planning permission for serviced accommodation, apart hotel and similar. I'm a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society as well, which means I have more initials after my name than I have in front of them. I'm an accredited CPD trainer. I'm an active planning consultant. I teach planning through our Victory Plan, and I am published in YPN every quarter. And the next installment of that is essentially a written version of what you're about to get. It's a written version of the regulation on serviced accommodation. So if you want a slightly more detailed version, then YPN is probably your friend there. I represent Town Planning Expert Group. We were established in 2012. We're a general needs planning consultancy that covers England, and as soon as I can, I will drop Wales from the equation. We're a chartered planning practice with 3 chartered town planners on staff. We're an accredited and award-winning CPD training organisation. We've helped over 1,000 businesses with their development proposals, and we have a 90% at present success rate on planning approvals, which isn't that bad. What I'm going to go through a little bit tonight follows what we call our Victory Plan. Victory is a mnemonic. It stands for V for verify, I for intelligence, C for comparables, T for team, O for options, R for reality, and Y for you. It's a system, as it were, a set of instructions to help the planning system work better. And if you're interested, the next running of the Victory courses are on the 3rd of June and the 2nd of September, respectively. Details on the website. I will say no more than that. So there's Basil and there's Manuel. We're going to come back to Manuel at the end. Bless his cottons, the late and great Andrew Sachs taking abuse from the very present and correct John Cleese. Why is this so important? Well, the whole short-term let sector has evolved. That is very clear. It's all evolved. And what's happening today is the law and government are catching up with the evolution of this sector. It's important for serviced accommodation operators to understand what is going on in their industry as far as planning certainly is concerned. And therefore this presentation, this webinar, is here to bring you up to speed with the current issues facing serviced accommodation operators within the lens of town planning in England. I will dwell a little bit upon the other home nations and what they're doing in the serviced accommodation sector, but fundamentally the changes that are afoot are the changes that are occurring in England. So the first question when we think about SA is, what do you mean when you're talking about serviced accommodation? And the reason why we start here is because there are too many definitions of serviced accommodation, too many definitions. I've tried to put some here, and some of you might chuckle over this, but let's just go through it. We have the traditional holiday home. That's a form of serviced accommodation. And where those are occupied by families, those have traditionally fallen within use class C3. We've got assisted living. Assisted living has become a very palatable and profitable form of serviced accommodation, and they fall within class C3B. We have the short stay type of HMO, where you're short staying individual rooms inside a property, and they can either fall presently within C4 or sui generis. We have professional company lets, big companies like Tesco or PAL Europe or IBM or hotel chains seeking to take a let on a property and then use it to occupy their staff. That falls within C3C. We have Airbnb style serviced accommodation. Now, Airbnb has, well, has a whole different connotation to it nowadays, depending on which authority you're in. Some authorities say Airbnb is C1, some authorities say Airbnb is C3, or some authorities say Airbnb style is sui generis. Hotel, guest house, and bed and breakfast, those have traditionally fallen within class C1. But apart hotel, that is apartments inside the wrapper of a hotel, well, I've got those through on planning permissions as either C1 or as sui generis, again, dependent on the council. Halls of residence, well, they are most definitely a form of serviced accommodation, and they are getting more and more posh as time goes on. Halls in the fine city of Portsmouth now have swimming pools and gymnasiums and snooker tables and all sorts of manner of wonderful things that I as a student never had in my hall of residence in my first year undergrad. They are class C1. Co-living, well, co-living is like a hall of residence for people who aren't on full-time education, and they are sui generis as a general rule. They form that unique use. Now, you may laugh at the next one, secured serviced accommodation, a prison or a detention centre or similar, still serviced accommodation within the broad definition given. It is short-term stay, not a permanent place of residence, and you most definitely get your bills paid and food. I think that falls within the broad definition. They're class C2A. Hostels, sui generis at present. Caravans and holiday park homes, they're also sui generis. So that is the gamut, as it were, of serviced accommodation typology that we've historically had inside of England, this range. And that's the evolution that the government is trying to combat or trying to deal with. In terms of the law, we've had decisions now, especially in the case of Sheila Moore versus Secretary of State and Suffolk Coastal District, where it has been ruled that a form of serviced accommodation is not a dwelling house. Now, this became most prevalent in the 2019 Cambridge appeal decisions, where it was Anthony Warburton as the inspector for the Secretary of State ruled that the use of a number of flats in Roman House and Florian House as essentially what people would describe as the Airbnb mode, very short-term let style of serviced accommodation fell foul of Moore versus Secretary of State and was no longer recognisable by virtue of fact and degree to a house. Indeed, he says here, from the submissions, it is clear that there is a tremendous range of lets in terms of length of stay, which have occurred since the business commenced. Having considered all of the submissions, I accept that in certain circumstances, the longer dates, say 60 to up to 89 days even, can, as a matter of fact and degree, start to become indistinguishable from the character of usage from a 6-month AST let. The pattern of usage of a person or couple carrying or occupying a flat for, say, 2 to 3 months, in some cases might hardly be any different to a let of 91 days. What he struggled with here is what the difference was, but what he eventually came down on was Moore, and the judgments left him Moore, which was that by fact and degree, the nature of the use was materially different and therefore resulted in a material change of use. He ruled that these were indeed sui generis uses and therefore development requiring planning permission. This was an enforcement appeal, and the enforcement appeals were dismissed with the notices upheld. The other thing that's happened, and I think we can all understand this, I hope, is that serviced accommodation today forms a massive basis for multiple development modes. The government, in its papers, surmises quite correctly that SA has changed. It has changed so fundamentally over the last 15 years that it's no longer really representative of the form of holiday style short-term accommodation that we had in the 80s or the 90s. There's been a major expansion in the number and range of accommodation suppliers operating in this market. And that, in reality, is because of the massive increase in the number of serviced accommodation courses out there in the wild, with it being touted as an almost perfect development strategy. I'm sure we can all recognize some of these acronyms: rent to SA, or HMO to SA, or buy, refurb, refinance and rent to serviced accommodation. According to the property education sector, at least, if you're not into SA, you're a nobody. I put some of the courses that I just Googled earlier today. I literally just typed a rent to SA course into Google and came up with hundreds, and there's an example of the Google search. I've removed the course body, the providing body in each case, to protect the innocent. Let's go there. Now, fundamentally, as it stands, England is playing some catch up. The other nations have this pretty buttoned down. And I've put London in this list because they're a special case. So in Northern Ireland today, you have a short-term licensing scheme in place. It's treated as a change of use as well if it changes the character of use of the original property. So fundamentally, they've left it down to the decision maker for planning, but there is most definitely a short-term licensing scheme in place, and that is very much a catch-all. In Scotland, across the border, we once again have a short-term licensing scheme in place, and like the Northern Irish solution, it's treated as a change of use if it changes the character of the original property. Now, in difference to Northern Ireland, Scotland also has control areas where planning permission is always needed for SA. This is a form of Article 4 direction under the Scottish planning law, and they call them control areas, and it operates exactly the same way. In Wales, last year, they brought into force 2 new use classes governing serviced accommodation under classes C5 and C6. C5 covering second homes and C6 covering proper, true serviced accommodation with a 183-day threshold grace period, if you will, similar to the 90-day rule. PD allowances are in place to allow for the change of use from C5 and C6 to C3 and back again, and a mandatory licensing scheme is being consulted upon right now. Now, I've got London here as a special case because in London, you are subject to the 90-day rule, which is within the Deregulation Act 2015, and which in itself modified the Greater London Council General Powers Act of 1973. There's been a 90-day rule since the 1973 Act, and the current one that we talk about is the one that we take from the 2015 Act. planning permission required for serviced accommodation of any type in the capital if you breach the 90-day grace period. So England's playing catch up. That's what's occurring. The key problem that's been identified is that there is inconsistency in how it's dealt with by individual councils. Cornwall thinks it's sui generis. Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, BCP Council, think it's C1, so does Southend. London thinks it's sui generis. If you go up north and you ask them about serviced accommodation, they look at you funny. They also look at you funny in the city of Portsmouth, where apparently they've only ever been asked once and they didn't know what to do with it. So there's a whole variety of different councils out there trying to deal with essentially the same question, but with their own spin on things. This is because serviced accommodation as a thing has habitually been left in a grey area, where this decision is left to council as to where serviced accommodation actually falls. And if they've never experienced it before, they simply won't know. In addition to those tools, in addition to this, the tools that councils have to deal with bad actors in other parts of the market, take HMOs, for example, are very limited when it comes to SA. There's no HMO licensing required per se for serviced accommodation. It's not an HMO. And therefore, what tools has a council got to its disposal to actually deal with these bad actors? Unlike HMOs, hotels and B&B, it's also very difficult to monitor compliance with key health and safety regulations. There is this inconsistency. HMOs have the HHSRS. Hotels and B&Bs are monitored by the Health and Safety Executive, by Environmental Health, and under the Hoteliers Acts. They've got their own regulation to consider, whereas serviced accommodation in its truest form, the Airbnb type, has not had to deal with any of that. So what's happening? Let's get to what is the government doing. So the first thing that's happening is that serviced accommodation is getting its own definition, and that definition makes clear that it is not a dwelling house or an HMO. So the hiding spots are going to be going. Now, the government have to provide a definition because this has to give a basis for what they're doing next, which is a registration scheme and a new use class in England. And I'll come on to those in a minute. It is designed specifically, and I've got the definition as suggested by government there. I'll read it to you in a second, to detach it from the common hidey holes of hotel or HMO or house, and to catch all of the targets that they intend to catch with this form of definition. Serviced accommodation will be a short-term rental property or serviced accommodation which is either a dwelling or part of a dwelling which is provided by a person, the host, to another person, the guest, for use by the guest as accommodation other than the guest's only or principal residence, in return for payment, whether or not by the guest, and in the course of a trade or business carried out by the host, or any dwelling or premises or part of a dwelling premises not falling within paragraph A, but which is also specified for purposes inside of this paragraph, i.e. which calls itself serviced accommodation. So you're caught by a definition of what it is, and then you're also caught if you call yourself an SA provider. I sense a lot of gurus are going to be changing their course's title very, very shortly. Now, this is not a time-bound definition, such as that used in London, the 90-day rule, or in Wales, the 183-day rule. There is no time bound on this. You fall into this effectively from day one. And this new definition will apply to all of England. There's no proposition at present to give London its own ability to define something. This will be a definition that applies to all of England, effectively to draw everyone in the final home nation, together with one idea of what SA is and does. To coincide with this, serviced accommodation gets its own use class. The new use class, called Class C5, is a complete catch-all. I don't think I've found a loophole out of this. And it says C5 short-term let is use of a dwelling house that is not a sole or main residence for temporary sleeping accommodation for the purposes of holiday, leisure, recreation, business, or any other travel. Second homes that are additionally let out for a part of the year will also fall within the C5 short-term let class where they meet the definition. So I think that's as much of a catch-all as it's possibly likely to be. It's there to catch those homes which are being used for the purposes of holiday, leisure, recreation, business, or any other travel. Serviced accommodation will get permitted development rights, at least for now. Let's talk about this a little bit. So making a new use class has the effect of making something a material change of use, because use classes give us a broad-based testing tool for what is and is not a material change of use. Now, the government understands that if it were to just throw the whole market into disarray, it would be a bad thing. And so to maintain the status quo, for now at least, the government is proposing a new permitted development allowance from C3 to C5 and back again. C3 to C5 and back again. Now, the PD allowance at present is designed to be an open allowance. It's designed to be an allowance that you can just use. You don't have to ask for it. But, and here's the but, within the consultation, the government is also asking the question as to whether or not there should be a form of prior approval or prior notification. Now, PNs are very in vogue at the moment with this particular government. They provide that modicum of control that councils like. It becomes, yes, more difficult for a council to file an Article 4 against a prior notification style of permitted development right, but it also provides them a sense of control. What would the assessment criteria be? We do not know. At the moment, it's just an idea. But I think it's an idea that needs some attention, because if this does become prior notification, that means you're going to be applying for serviced accommodation type uses out of houses. What is absolutely inconspicuously absent are the other typical SA type strategies of C4 to C5 and sui generis to C5. Now, these form of SA types, SA changes of use, are notably absent, but are very popular, especially in areas where HMOs have become less attractive over serviced accommodation types where you're promised £1,000 or so per week instead of £1,000 or so per month. It is very clear that if you want to use an HMO as serviced accommodation after this becomes law, then you will need planning permission. There will be no permitted development right for that, and there will be no escape from that need to apply either. It will become a material change of use, and it will become a material change of use requiring express consent from the local planning authority. So that is something that everyone, I think, needs to pay mind to. Article 4 will be inevitable. Now, I can't say this strongly enough. those areas that already consider serviced accommodation requires a change of use, such as the recent decisions in Cornwall, for example, mean that for those areas where there's already a modicum of control, those councils will be encouraged to reinforce that control through the use of Article directions. Now, if you bring in an immediate Article 4 direction for something that was previously not considered to be development needing planning permission, then you get hammered for compensation as a council. However, if you have a authority where, let's say, there's already a modicum of control, there's already the requirement to apply for planning permission, then there wouldn't actually be any compensation to be paid because they're not technically removing anything. Therefore, in London and the other areas that already control the SA type, this could actually be a lawful immediate Article 4 direction because there would be no compensation to be paid. You needed planning permission before and you would need planning permission either. They're essentially immediately taking away the permitted development right. Now, ultimately, this will be subject to the tests set out in the MPPF on new Article 4 directions, but I think could well be justified for areas like Cornwall, especially the Cornish coast, where serviced accommodation has become such a problem. Now, ultimately, you are going to be able to apply for changes of use into SA and new build serviced accommodation, and these will carry planning fees. The planning fees are to be set, and at present we're looking at £462 per dwelling, which is the same fee that you would expect if you were building a new home from scratch. How the serviced accommodation type use is controlled will be down to the council, but again, I'm sure conditions will come into play when they come to consider type of occupation, how many occupants, etc. It's worthwhile just reflecting on what's happening outside of the planning system, just in our last couple of slides, because we have a circumstance where we're also seeing a mandatory registration scheme being consulted upon. Now, based on everything I've read today in preparation of this talk, just to bring myself up to speed, that light touch is what they're calling it, but mandatory scheme is going to be brought forward as an amendment to the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. That is expected by the summer now, and you will require a license when this is brought in to run a serviced accommodation unit. It's likely to form a very similar type to HMO licensing and is likely to be a duplicate of one of the home nations' short-term let licensing schemes already in operation. Scotland and Northern Ireland already have their scheme in place. Wales is shortly to introduce theirs, and as you'll see from the Belfast Telegraph article that I put on the screen here, Ireland, the country of Ireland, not part of the UK, but one of our oldest friends, is also bringing its own short-term letting licensing scheme to the fore, and that has passed law now. So this is coming. Now, if you're interested in it, you can actually track all of this online. It will be a mandatory registration scheme. It will focus on serviced accommodation operators only, where other type of guest accommodation, such as hotels, B&Bs, professional providers of self-contained accommodation will be exempted. No definitions yet on professional providers, but very much, I think, focused here on the Airbnb crowd, unfortunately. There's likely to be expected standards in place and a form of enforcement. to address negative community and housing market effects. Remember, of course, this mandatory scheme is a bit seditious. And it's a bit seditious because ultimately, by making this mandatory, by forcing you as SA operators to apply for a license and saying if you don't, there is a fine associated with it that you'll pay for. They're also providing data, big data, to help local authorities understand how bad the situation is inside of the inside of their own areas. Fundamentally, it's there though to ensure that all providers of short-term lets provide safe, quality assured accommodation as other providers of guest accommodation like HMOs, like hotels, like B&Bs must do already. And so it's essentially bringing parity to everything going on. But what we have to focus our attention on is it's coming, it's being consulted upon, and it's going to be popped into the Levelling and Regeneration Bill. I wanted to round off this little talk with some thoughts. What does it mean for you? First things first, let's be honest. For those of you that believe that serviced accommodation is and always will be immune from planning and licensing and regulation and everything else, forget it. Big Brother has been watching you. Big Brother is coming. This has been coming down the road for a while now. And you have to remember this is a walloping vote winner for our present embattled Prime Minister. This will really assist them in getting votes won in certain areas. And so, look, it's going to happen. What you need to do is take some time to check and make sure you're delivering good quality accommodation that serves the local community well. Hey, if you're a good person providing good quality accommodation in the area in which you work, great. This is focused on the bad actors. If you're an existing operator, then evidence up. Make sure you've got that documentary evidence in the form of bookings, in the form of receipts, whatever you can get hold of that demonstrates when your serviced accommodation use started. So when that new use class goes live, you can protect yourself against planning enforcement. When HMOs became a thing, we said over and over again, evidence up. You will need to define this. And lo and behold, today, we are still scratching around for evidence from HMO landlords who effectively haven't evidenced up prior to their HMO becoming an HMO. Good old Manuel, I said we'd come back to him. His phrase, "Que, I know nothing." Well, you know what? It's not about knowing nothing. Register for that license as soon as you can do so and stay on the right side of the legislation. Again, this is focused on bad actors in the marketplace. And what we want you to do is be a good actor in the marketplace. These interventions have only come about when there has been an unwanted shift, and there has been an unwanted shift. It's very clear that the market has moved and that the government has to act upon it. So for you, dear viewer, inside of this webinar, it's down to you to stay that right side of the law. And my final thought is now is not the time to rush into an area because it could become Article 4. These changes are not law yet, and any such rush would result in that area adopting a nuclear approach and Article 4ing as soon as they are able to do so. You want to take a more balanced approach to this. If your target market is a certain area and that area has already dropped the hammer and said, no, you need planning permission, then fine, adopt that approach. Now it's not to change anything. Now is to advise you what's coming down the road so you can be on the right side of things. If in doubt, ask. We're in a state of planning flux again. We're going to be for a while. We're waiting for a new act. We're waiting for a new MPPF. We're waiting now, apparently, for variations to the use classes order again. And the worst thing that can happen is a market panics. The worst thing that can happen is everyone abandons, let's say, a whole village because they don't want to apply for a license when it might actually be easy. To quote from the Cornish language, you want to handle this directly, meaning at some point and without a state of urgency. You want to watch for those changes when they kick in and get yourself safe. And you should be in a fine position. This is about watching for the change in the tide, not necessarily jumping out of the water just because it's turned a slightly different color. Ultimately, this will only hurt you if you ignore what's going on with that tide. Get it sorted, and please don't be a Manuel. That ends the sort of talky part of tonight's webinar. I'm going to stop sharing now so I can see the screen again, and hopefully there'll be some questions in the chat. Oh, Jesus, there are a few. So let's see how we get on. Liam says, any chance I can get a copy of the slides? Yes, of course you can, Liam. I will put a link to them with the webinar on the Anti-Gurus. You'll be able to download them at your leisure. And he also says, that's a lot of cases. Yes, Liam, it's going to be, well, it's a lot that I'm dealing with right now, but it's also going to be a lot when this happens. Planners apparently love to make work for planners. Let's go and have a look. Yeah, do a master's in urban planning. I'm going grey after 21 years, Liam. You're only starting out. Jesus knows what you'll look like at the end. Right. Does the government Alexander says, does the government regulation override local regulation like London's? Right, at present, as far as we can tell, yes, it will. This is an all England approach where London's very special circumstance will get overridden by a different way of doing things. And so, yes, there will be some overriding, especially in those authorities which consider it to be something else. They'll be told, no, we've now defined it, it is this. That overriding occurs because of the breakdown in different approaches. Let's go down to another question. Housing delivery targets will lose him votes, which I think he's realised, and that's currently up in the air. It's an interesting one, to be fair. Liam, they're not really getting rid of the housing delivery test, which is the enhanced test. Effectively, they're getting rid of the 5-year land supply target, which is messy, but we always knew this was going to happen anyway, so it's kind of fine. I don't think that'll lose him so many votes. That'll probably win him a few in like the authorities like Buckinghamshire and Surrey and Sussex. Surrey's quite funny because I always have to apologise because Surrey, it's easy to say sorry that you live in Surrey. But anyway, Surrey and Sussex and Kent and Essex, where they've been really hammered with this type of case law. I'm not surprised he's going for that. Anne says, in Scotland, councils cannot cope with the amount of applications. And that is the same as it is in England, sadly, at the moment. That's the problem with regulation. Once regulation gets laid upon regulation, you end up in a circumstance where you need more planners and there aren't enough planners. Right. More questions. That's because graduate planners prefer to work in private while the public sector so are struggling to recruit planners. Yes, they are. The RTPI hilariously thought a £5,000 bursary for 50 planners would be enough for England. That's nowhere near enough. We need probably about 500. That's probably going to get me struck off saying that because I've just questioned the RTPI, but sod it. Do we have any idea of timescales? James asks. Yes, we do. This is likely to be summer now. Charlie's had his coronation. God bless the king, blah, 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 blah. Now he's capable of signing stuff again. We're expecting this to get through Parliament before the summer recess. MPPF changes are all bundled into this as well. Use classes changes are all bundled into this as well. It was a 1 month consultation. It was a really short consultation. So look, it's coming. Summer is where I anticipate it to be. You're welcome, Chris. I'm glad the presentation was useful. In Scotland, licenses are costing £1,000 per property. I am not surprised. That's akin to HMO licensing in England. Really, really scary numbers there. Thank you, Anne, for that. How will England cope with the massive applications? I don't know, Anne. I might defect to France, where there is no planning system. Keep going. Joy says, thanks for sharing knowledge. How have listed buildings been treated in Scotland and Wales? Will PD apply? As far as I can tell, the PD right in England will allow listed buildings to be bundled into it. They're not exempting listed buildings in England. Listed buildings will get another PD right. Lovely. Doesn't exempt your need for a listed building consent. In Scotland and Wales, the Welsh PD allowances don't exempt listed buildings. They are in, as are buildings in conservation areas, etc. I believe the only thing you can't do is change use of a castle. And in Scotland, it's down to fact and degree, basically, as to whether or not it is a change of use. Does prior approval mean we'll need to ask first? Yes. Yes, it does. If this becomes prior approval, which is in vogue and very popular for government right now, it's an easy way to get PD rights through, then yes, you'll actually have to apply for it. That's going to be fun if they do it, and we have no idea. And then she asks, how can you help us? By disseminating information in the first instance, like we're doing here with this webinar. Sui generis seems like an interesting flexible classification. Is that right? No, it can be really strict and it can be really messy. So I did jump some, because everyone's talking, which is wonderful. I did jump some things, and it's asking me if I want to download an emoji, which is not appropriate. Dan says there's nothing wrong coming from Surrey. Dan, I was born in Surrey. I escaped. Is it now worth in Greater London area to apply for planning for SA to avoid the 90-day rule? If so, what use class is SA for a C3 property? It's sui generis in London, Alexander. You can most definitely apply, and most councils have a policy which will guide you as to where they will and will not allow it. There's also a policy in the London plan. So what will happen with ongoing bookings? This is Elise. At the gap of timeline due to delay with planners. Well, essentially, if you've got SA now, the theory is you'll gain grandfather rights over it. So it will be SA on the day that the change happened, therefore it will be SA forevermore. This is a proactive, not really a retroactive change. So it may very well be the case that they deal with it that way. But yeah, we just need to make it work effectively. Felicia, please put a comment in the question in the chat, because that's how we're organizing it. Past Joy, Emma, thanks, John. I really have to shoot off, but really interesting. You're welcome. Emma, we'll leave it open for another couple of questions. Questions in the chat, please, and then we will close it out. Scotland, can one trade as an SA while waiting for a license? I don't know. It's licensing, not planning, and I'm not a Scottish planner. I simply don't know is the answer. Sorry, Felicia. It's one of those where it's outside of the planning framework. Time for one more question. We'll do it fastest finger first. Alexander, good last question here. So if new regulations come in summer, then applying for new use class for SA will be under PD. Yes, if the regulations also come alongside with a permitted development right, if any delay occurs between the two, then you will have to apply for planning permission in the short intervening period. That's what happened with HMOs. And we can see that happening again, to be fair. But yes, you'll be applying for SA under a permitted development or under a planning permission. To be fair, this is catching out people in Wales right now. I've got a case where I've got a building that is going to go to the new use class C6, and the owner wasn't really aware. And then the final one from G Matthew, I'm in the process of setting up an SA. What is my next step? At the moment, as you are, carry on as you are, but evidence the hell up. So you need to know exactly when you started, record when you started taking bookings, when you started taking guests, evidence up, because the last thing you would want to do is not evidence up. There we go. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope that's been interesting to you all. We hope to do another one in about 3 months' time, and that'll probably be on biodiversity net gain, which is coming out of the woodwork to hit property developers hard in November, and I'm sure will be a very interesting addition to the lecture library, as it were. But for all and sundry, we are done. So have a good evening, everyone, and I will see you anon.